Okay, guys, I think we are now live on Facebook. I want to welcome everybody. We normally are on YouTube, but YouTube is being wonky today. So we are going to be on Facebook, which is just okay with me. This is our monthly Alabama Work Comp Today show, and this is our May edition. And we try to bring you each month a friend of ours, a colleague who does the same type of work that we do in different parts of the country. And this month, we've got our friend Paolo Longo from the Orlando, mid-state Florida area with us. Good afternoon, Paolo.
Hey guys, how are you? Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be with
Paolo.
you.
Absolutely. Dave and I, Dave's known Paolo a lot longer. I think, weren't you guys at the Capstone at the same time or close to it?
We were, I think we were there at the same time.
Overlapped a couple of years, yeah. Roll Tide.
Very good. Well, guys, before we jump into this month's topics, Paolo, for the folks out there who may not know you or your firm, tell us a little bit about your practice and yourself and what you guys do in mid-state for your clients.
Well, so for the past, this is my 21st year. My firm practices primarily in the area of workers' compensation. But we specialize with the representation of mostly first responders, police, fire, and corrections. They have some specific special presumptions here in Florida. And so as a result, we do a lot of work with our first responders. I practice in Orlando, but I run all over the state. We have an office down in West Palm Beach and another office down in Miami and Dade County. So we run all over the state, representing police and firefighters.
Well, it's unlike Alabama, where you get from one end of the state to the other in about 5 hours. You've got a big state. You guys are spread out. No wonder you've got offices in different locations. And I don't know how many thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of first responders there are throughout your state. So I know you guys have a big job and do a lot of work for them, and it's so vitally needed.
I go through a lot of tires on my car, I can tell you that.
Oh, I bet you do. I want to welcome a buddy of ours, Josh Holden, who usually is on the other side of cases. So maybe Josh will either learn a little bit from us today, wink, wink, or maybe he can chime in where we are wrong and he can set us on the right path. But
I'm sure that Josh will gladly jump in and tell us when we're wrong.
Well, thank you, Josh, for spending a couple of minutes with us. As we do for each of these, we put together an itinerary of articles from around the country that have come up in the last few weeks. And of course, they have been predominantly cases and real life situations dealing with the pandemic, with COVID-19. And what we do is we take from an employer, employment, employee, independent contractor standpoint, and that's what we're discussing this month and each of these episodes. And Dave, last month we had Mike Gruber out of New York, and Mike is so well versed and has such a great practice in New York. What were kind of some of your takeaways from our discussion? Because we really hit this issue pretty hard. I know what we said last month may or may not apply this month, which may or may not apply next month.
Yeah. I mean, just in Alabama alone, since we were together and talked with Mike last month, there's been two or three orders from the governor about slowly reopening our state. Mm-hmm. And so what we see is that not only do we have a federal system in place, but you got 50 states who are dealing with how to reopen and how that impacts people that are working and whether they have to go back and how that impacts unemployment. So those are some of the big issues we looked at last month, and some of the big issues that we're facing today is how are we reopening? How are people going back to work, and whether they have to go back to work?
Paolo, what's in Florida? What is the current, I guess it's current law in Florida, whatever the governor's proclamations are as they come out? We've had stay at home, and then a few weeks later we had safer at home. which was a graduated scale of slowly getting back into society. Now we have an amended version of that, and that's due to go through, I think, through early July, and then by then we'll have yet another proclamation. What's the current, what can and can't you do just in general terms in Florida?
Well, in Florida, I mean, we're as far south as you can get, but we call it the wild, wild west. We did have, lockdown for a while, but not that many people, listened. We did have some beaches closed for a little while. Currently we are on, a modified, excursions, right? I mean, people are back at work, restaurants. I think this week they started back to 50% capacity. And then, so we're in what's called phase 2, where that'll start on Monday, where youth sports can go back to playing. The beaches are reopened. We had a lot of people, boating and at the beach over the holiday weekend. We did have some bad weather that stymied some of that, but South Florida is a little bit different. My Miami office, for example, when everything shut down, they wouldn't let us in the building even. I mean, we weren't even allowed in the building. We just started this week. They let us back in the building, and they have everybody separate, in our office space, in our office building. But it's pretty lenient down here. I mean, people are going about their business. Traffic is just as bad as it ever was. People are at the beaches, but restaurants, people are trying to maintain social distancing. Of course, the big attractions are Disney and Universal and stuff here in Orlando where we live. We just got notice from them. I think they're going to start mid-July. Disney has a plan to get back started. Hotels, for the most part, are still either not operating or at like maybe 25% capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the restaurants and resorts and stuff are still closed. But your normal everyday mom and pop restaurants that are open, they at the table separated, no bar seating, things like that.
Sure.
But people are getting out and about.
Dave, and we'll get started into these articles in just a second. Dave, what's been your observation, if any, about the mindset of the younger generations being out in public and wearing masks and social distancing versus the older generations? And when I say older, I mean like 40 and older versus the kids, the teens, the 20-year-olds.
Yeah. Today is a National Hamburger Day. And so my 11-year-old and I celebrated, and in recognition of National Hamburger Day, went to a hamburger joint not too far from the office, and she and I had our masks on, and I think we were the only customers out of about 15 to 20 that I saw in and out of the restaurant that had masks on. And that would range, I'd say that was from little kids to 30-year-olds up to 40-year-olds. And, that was just one example from today.
It just seems like it's a generational mindset. It also seems maybe smaller communities versus bigger communities. And this is not a knock on any, it's just my observation. In the bigger cities like Birmingham, Montgomery, maybe Orlando, I don't know. There's a lot more, just my observation, a lot more observance of social distancing and wearing of masks versus if you go into the small towns, it just doesn't seem to be as concerning. That's just a general observation. Well, guys, let's jump into our first article. This one comes out of Wisconsin. What if you're not ready to go back to work during the coronavirus pandemic? And every state really has its own features or its own proclamations for what's expected in the public space and in the private space. Here it says the Supreme Court ordered Wisconsin businesses will reopen and people will be back at work. And Paolo, from this, how does reading through this, and I know that you don't get a lot of detail out of Wisconsin, but it's just an article that kind of highlights what everybody's thinking. How do you take this article and maybe compare it a little bit to what you're observing now in Florida?
Well, I mean, I think generally the feeling is, I mean, everywhere, including Florida and Wisconsin, everywhere else. I mean, I think people want to get back to work. I mean, people they want to feel better. They want to see the light at the end of the tunnel and hope it's not a train coming at them. People want to go back to work. I think if you give them the opportunity, they will come back. Just telling everybody you will be back maybe wasn't the best way to go about doing it. But especially in a state like Florida, and specifically in a town like Orlando, this is a very tourist driven area. We have more hotel rooms in Orlando than in any city in the world. And you have hotels that are 70-80% packed during the year, where they're like ghost towns. So these people that, the service industry and those folks, they want to go back to work. They want to do it in a healthy way, in a safe way. And they expect that their employers are going to do things to take care of them and to look out for them. But I think, the general consensus is folks want to go back to work.
They sure do, because it's the alternative. Sure, just is. It can drive you crazy.
It's been a nightmare in Florida for the unemployment. So you have, literally millions in the state of Florida, furloughed or laid off. Specifically, even in Orlando, we've had. I mean, Disney laid off 100,000 workers. I mean, there are towns in Wisconsin that don't have 100,000 people in them, and when you have millions and millions and millions of people trying to get unemployment, the system breaks down. They're not getting paid. Nobody wants to live on unemployment, even if they can get it. So the feeling is people want to go back, but they want to do it in a safe manner. I mean, that I think that's really the balance, is how to get everybody back and to do it, where you have people feel comfortable about going back to work.
Well, this next question and article is for both of you guys. I'll start with David. COVID-19 pandemic. Most people are uneasy about returning to work, according to a survey out of Salt Lake City. David, what if I'm an Alabama employee and my company says, we need you back at the warehouse because we've got orders to fill? And you respond to your supervisor, I've been home for 6 weeks now. I am not ready to come back into the workplace because I don't know how safe it is. Now, there's no evidence, there's no communication. The employee doesn't have any reason to think that there's COVID-19 in his workplace, but that's just his mindset. And he's in the majority, according to this survey.
Yeah.
If you're the employer, how do you deal with that?
Yeah. Well, OSHA does require that employers have a clean, safe workplace for their employees. Unfortunately for that worker, if there's work available for him and he chooses not to come back, then if his employment is at will, like most employees in Alabama, then he can be terminated or let go for not returning to work. Further, if the employer has work available for the employee, they may not be entitled to any more unemployment compensation benefits. And then the last thing I'll add on that is that now if the employee has some medical issues, diabetes or asthma or some other type of medical condition, then they may be under the Americans with Disabilities Act be qualified for some protections there concerning their employment. But those are going to be a very fact-specific issue. Mm-hmm. But in general, I would say that for most employees, they got to go back to work.
With Alabama being an at-will employment state, if there's no evidence of those things, the company has the right to conduct its business and go forward. Paolo, what if this is a warehouse company in Florida with the same scenario?
Same thing. I mean, most employees are at will here too. And, I think it takes something more than just just feeling uneasy. That's not going to get an employee anywhere. Being nervous or being uneasy about going back to work is not going to keep your job. So the reality is, if your employer says we're open for business, we need you, we got orders to fill, and you don't come to work, then that employer is going to find somebody, because there's lots of unemployed people out there that are happy to take that job. In my firm specifically, we've got, some people that are on the range of health. So, we've opened up our office a couple of weeks ago, and we started doing sort of a rotation. We had a Tuesday, Thursday staff and a Monday, Wednesday staff, and kind of brought them in a little at a time. And we said, as much as you're comfortable coming back, we provided everybody masks. We Lysol, the office, and we do the things that we can do. And it's been working so far. And if somebody, one of our employees wants to wear a mask, they're free to do that. But the work has to get done. And so far we've been lucky, but the general, law down here is, unless you have, a medical note, some restrictions or something from a doctor saying, you are high risk, or you've tested positive or something like that, then that employer is going to need to fill that position. And it can be with you, or it can be with somebody else.
Sounds like you and your office and your staff have done this the right way.
Well, we're trying. We don't run a full-on democracy here, but we definitely want input. We value our employees, and we want them to be vested in their work, and we want them to feel comfortable. And if they're here and they're nervous and they're scared, then they're not productive, and that doesn't do anybody good. So we try to do what we can with regard to cleaning and spacing, and we don't have a lot of clients coming in and out. We do that by appointment only in specific places, and clean up, and we provide masks. And, we rotate the staff in, but Monday, everybody's agreed to come back. So Monday we're coming back full staff, and everybody's agreed to do it. We've had no pushback.
Yeah, we're not quite there yet with our firm. We've had a kind of a skeleton crew, if you will, paralegals working from home. We did have one paralegal come in for almost 2 weeks, but then her husband's coworker tested positive. So just out of precaution, she's gone back home for the next couple of weeks. And I know that lots of law firms, because that's just obviously who we talk to mainly, are implementing their new policies and procedures about bringing back staff. We still haven't had any public visit our firm. We haven't needed to, frankly. We've just been able to figure all this out virtually. But I know that's coming in the upcoming weeks or so, where the public will start visiting us again. But you're right, you got to have policies and procedures in place. And Dave, you mentioned OSHA just a few minutes ago. OSHA has come out with new regulations that were effective as of Tuesday this week that reverses their policy from April. That's how quickly some of these things go. And now, as I read this article and the issuance by OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration says, if you're a company that's subject to OSHA's rules and regulations, which I think is 10 or more people, employees, plus maybe certain other types of businesses, if you suspect COVID-19 in the workplace or exposure, previously, they basically have said employers are not epidemiologists, they're not scientists, they don't have an obligation proactively to investigate it. But now, effective this week, if it's suspected and they reasonably have reasonable information, then they now have to be proactive. And hopefully, one, that gives some peace of comfort to those who work in the workplace that something's being done, even though there may be the issue of COVID in their office. But two, and we're going to get to this in a minute, Paolo and David, how do you prove one of those cases? What if their investigation comes back and says, we have, from our investigation now, figured out, here's where it came from, this is what happened over the course of the days, and now we have a report from OSHA. My question to you is, do you think that you could use that investigative report or findings to help support a claim if you bring a work comp claim that someone contracted COVID-19 in the workplace, which led to some permanent injury?
Paolo, you want to tackle that from a Florida perspective?
Yeah, I mean, Florida is a strange creature, and I don't even think there's an OSHA office in our whole state. So, an OSHA directive down here doesn't really mean a whole lot. So if I'm representing somebody with COVID, and by the way, I've got cases right now, COVID cases, I'm not looking for an OSHA report because they just don't carry a lot of weight down here. Um, so it's very, very difficult absent some kind of a presumption, absent a legislative fix or an executive order that's going to carry the day in a COVID case. I can appreciate and respect OSHA for setting out those parameters, and certainly they're worth following and paying attention to if you're an employer. I mean, I'm an employer. I've got 16 staff. I've got to do what I can to provide a safe work environment for them. But if a client calls me and says, "Hey, I got COVID," working at the grocery store, and there's an OSHA report, it's not going to do me a lot of good, in a court down here.
Dave, you got any thoughts on that?
Well, we've been talking from the beginning about this, that these are going to be hard cases to prove that someone contracted COVID-19 or coronavirus at their place of work and to make it into a workers' compensation claim, because it is something that can be contracted pretty much anywhere, at the grocery store, at a restaurant, coming in contact with the public. So it's going to be hard to narrow it down and say that it was acquired at work or while working. So it's a causation issue. Very tough case to prove.
Yeah, and
Not
I think
impossible, but hard.
I think that's the reason why so many states have issued executive orders, talking about at least the frontline workers to be. I think there must be 18 or 19 states already. I'm just going through a list here of states that issued executive orders either through their legislative process or by their governor, stating that if a frontline worker, if somebody who is not subject to quarantine, right, like a nurse or a doctor or a fireman or a police officer or somebody that a primary essential worker, they can't go home and quarantine for 2 weeks. In Florida, we had such a problem with so many police and firefighters that were quarantined that our state actually in a lot of counties were bringing back retired folks. If you had been retired for 3 years or less, the state would re-up your certification and put you back on the job. So imagine if you're calling 911 and you got a bunch of retirees showing up. I mean, they still know what they're doing, but you got to be in a pretty bad space. We had departments that were sending 20, 30, 40, 50 people home for 2 weeks. That's a whole fire station. That's several fire stations. So I think that absent some kind of a legislative fix or, an executive order from a governor, that's the reason why so many states have been doing that, is because there's some people that just can't quarantine. So if they're working, double shifts and triple shifts, their potential exposure percentage goes way up from somebody who's, okay, they're sitting on the couch, Netflix and chill for 10 weeks. That guy's not going to get COVID, right? But a nurse or a doctor or somebody or a first responder, the odds of them contracting the virus, go up astronomically. But your regular guy working down at, Joe's Mufflers, if he gets COVID, that case in Florida, it's impossible. Forget it.
Hey, that list that you've got, where's Alabama on that list?
I think it's probably in the absent column.
Yeah, you're not going to find it.
Our politicians and mayors, governors, they talk about how important our first responders, healthcare workers, and medical professionals are, and we love them. And they do such a great job. But what they haven't done is past a presumption that if they
Florida's not on that list either. Okay, guys, Florida's not on that list. So, but there's a lot of states, and there's a lot of states in the South. I mean, Arkansas, Kentucky. I mean, there's some North Carolina, South Carolina. So, you've got some states, in the traditional, red part of the country, that are doing what I'm going to call the right thing with regard to frontline workers, which is establish a presumption. And if you think about it from from a risk management perspective, right? I mean, what's the downside? There's no medical treatment, right? Yeah, a couple of weeks of quarantine, lost wages, and a happy employee that wants to go back to work. I mean,
I think what it is, Paolo, it's the fear of the unknown from the medical standpoint. If we allow this first line of medical care, but what if he develops a permanent condition with his lungs and can no longer ever go back to work? We don't want to buy all that.
Well, agreed. But, that's the whole point of the system, is for the system to bear the burden of the expense, not the whole society. So, that's the age old workers' comp question. Who bears the burden for work related illness? And if you don't let people go home and you force them to go to work and they get some crazy deadly virus,
Yep.
Why should they end up being taken care of by the taxpayer when you have a system put in place to pay, how many other claims were filed, your regular orthopedic cases during the past, 2 or 3 months? I would venture to guess that they're very, very few, right?
Because probably plummeted on a percentage wise.
But they've paid for premiums, right?
Yeah.
The premiums have been paid. So there's funds in the system to pay a couple of weeks of quarantine wages, right? The death rate or serious illness rate of this disease, although it is a lot of people in general, the percentage rate is less than 0.5%. So as a risk manager, I would say, I'm going to risk less than 0.5%, to pay a guy 2 weeks or 3 weeks lost wages. In Florida, you have to be out for a week anyway. So the first week you don't even get paid. Mm-hmm. So if somebody goes home for 2 weeks, you're only paying a week of wages.
Yeah, it's 3 days here is the waiting period. David, you hear all this reasonableness coming out of Paolo? We don't get much of that when these discussions are being made in Montgomery. But that then leads us,
great points.
If we can't even get from the physical side of this, this next article is even a bigger leap, because it talks about traumatic stress from COVID-19 that's raised with frontline responders. How could we ever expect, if let's take it outside of the pandemic setting? I want you to find Alabama on that list again, Paolo. Where would Alabama be, David, when it deals with traumatic stress with first line responders?
Yeah. So let's start with this. In Alabama, in order for work comp to pay for medical treatment on what we call a mental or psychological injury, you first have to have a physical injury. So you got to have a physical injury in order for work comp to pay for mental treatment. So what this article talked about was traumatic stress that first responders are facing and every day, all day long, dealing with people, dealing with the stress, taking care of sick people. So if that person, that frontline healthcare nurse worker is in Alabama and they say to their employer, I need medical treatment now, I'm dealing with some mental issues, that's going to be a denied claim in Alabama, because there's got to be a physical injury in order for there to be a mental injury under Alabama work comp. Dealing with people, dealing with stress.
Well, I'm gonna raise you here in Florida. It's even worse than that. Not only do you not get, you have to have, like in Alabama, a physical injury to get mental or nervous injury treatment. You only get mental or nervous injury treatment as long as you're treating for the physical. So when the physical injury is healed, the mental treatment stops regardless. So,
and that's the mindset of most adjusters and most insurance attorneys in Alabama, and probably the treating physicians themselves, that when the physical is healed, so is the mental.
Right. And I'm sure you guys all heard the story. There was a doctor who committed suicide after all this treatment, working, 15, 18, 20-hour shifts, day after day after day after day, and just seeing all the death and all the death and all the death. This doctor took their own life.
I believe a nurse as well.
Yeah, I think we're in New York, either New York City or New York State. I mean, that's terrible. And what I hear is, well, that's what they signed up for. They're signed up to be an emergency. Nobody signed up for this. Nobody signed up for this. They signed up for one or two at a time, not 500, people and all of them on respirators and nobody signed up for that. Nobody signed up for that.
One of the things in this article, when we talk about traumatic stress with first line responders, is really not until the world slows down for those first line responders, or because they're working on adrenaline and just kind of that mental memory that they've got into place about just being automatic and doing what they're trained to do. They don't take the time to process, and it's not until they slow down from their shifts or from a certain period of time, or maybe when there's less of this work to be done, does that kick in. So with the numbers, at least in Alabama, I think we may be the fastest rising number of cases in the country. And maybe part of that's due to the fact that we're getting more testing done. I don't know what they really attribute it to, but if I'm a first line responder in Alabama, my work is nowhere near done. I'm as busy now as I was 6 and 8 weeks ago. So how can you expect a first line responder, a critical care nurse at one of our busy hospitals, to have any downtime from any of this? I don't see how for weeks from now, hopefully not months, but I just don't see it. They're going to be diagnosing this for the next year.
Right, and another part of this that's unrelated to just doing the job is, I think the first line responders, a lot of them, are unable to, because of the work that they're doing, they're essentially quarantined when they're not at work, right? They're not able to spend time with their family. They're not able to see their kids or their wife or their husband because they're in a hospital. They're exposed to this stuff. They don't know if they're going to get it or not. And then when they get out of work, they can't go home. Yeah. So, not only do you have the mental stress of just dealing with sick people and all your patients dying regularly, then when you get out of work, you have the additional stress of not being able to, there's no coping mechanism for that part of it as well. So that I think, compounds.
They're not going home to hold their newborn.
No.
They're not home to be with their, a family member, their wife, their husband.
They're staying in a hotel across the street from the hospital.
Right. Which
they're
are
living.
Right. Yeah. And those are the things that they need to that would help, bring down that anxiety from the work, but they're denied, those outlets. So I think that just compounds the problem.
Yeah. They're living in the basement of their house, and the only way they see their 5-year-old son is through a plate glass window. There's so many stories.
Bernard, do you still have a neighbor that's living in a camper in his driveway?
Yeah. During the work week, he's moved the camper now closer to the hospital. He works in South Alabama, but brings it home on the weekends, and really he described this whole process because he has a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old at home. And he also has a wife who is an emergency medical trained nurse who she can't work because she has to take care of their children and desperately wants to be out there working, but they made a family decision for her to stay home right now. But the two individuals y'all both mentioned who became subject and committed suicide are in this article: 49-year-old ER nurse and a 23-year-old EMT, both of New York City. They were overwhelmed by the stress.
Yeah, nobody signed up for that.
No. Guys, let's move on we're going to move to the state of Florida for this article. And let's see, what day did this come out? This article came out, it's coming on 2 months ago. So Paolo, this article may be a little outdated. You may be able to help us a little bit. Catch coronavirus on the job. In Florida, workers' comp may not cover you.
It's not changed. They may not cover you 6 months ago, 6 weeks ago, or 6 months from now. Mm-hmm. In Florida, the burden is so high for an injured worker to prove a case, either what we call occupational disease or exposure. We had a couple of appellate decisions come out last year that, for all practical purposes, eliminated those claims. So if you're exposed to mold or guano or some, gas or whatever at work, and you get sick, too bad in Florida. Same thing with the coronavirus. We are fortunate, however, that the CFO of our state is a former firefighter, retired firefighter, and so he issued an executive order a couple of weeks ago saying that for all state employees that contracted COVID, they would be covered by Florida's the state workers' comp. The Department of Risk Management would cover those cases. So state employees, we've got, a lot of university hospitals, all those doctors and nurses, they're state employees. The Florida Highway Patrol, there's some fire marshals and other things like that. So those first line responders that are employed by the state are covered. And I've actually got two, unfortunately, I have two Highway Patrol death claims that my office is handling right now, where we lost two highway patrolmen to COVID. And fortunately, because of the CFO's directive, they are being covered by workers' comp, and those two gentlemen that died, their families are receiving the benefits that we have. As meager as they are, at least it's something. But
Paolo, are they considered death benefits?
Right. Yeah. Death benefits. Right.
Pursuant to the work comp laws or whatever amended.
Correct. So, there's a lot of questions going around. I mean, the CFO can't issue an executive order. I mean, I don't think legally, if that was challenged, I think any judge would say you don't have the authority to do that. But I think it's important that because he's the director of the risk management for the state, he's telling his people, we're going to cover these for my employees. We're going to do the right thing. So I think it sets the tone. And there's been some other folks up in the Capitol here in Florida that are telling insurance companies, you should do this. And some of them are, but I would tell you that any other municipality, a county, a city, some of our big state, our big employers, grocery stores, things like that, these people get COVID and file a case, unless you have a very, loving employer that says, hey, cover my employee, they're not going to get covered. And and if they're not going to do it voluntarily, there's 0% chance of proving your case. So you've got to have hopefully you work for a benevolent dictator in Florida.
Are you aware of any lawsuits that have been filed for people who either have succumbed to the disease or have contracted it and have maybe permanent injuries?
I don't know of any that have been filed yet, but I have spoken to some of my colleagues throughout the state, and there are a couple in the works. But they're for death claims. They're not for injury cases. I mean, either they get sick for a little while and they get better, or in the cases that I've heard of, the people have passed away. So I think that there will be some cases, and I know of a handful that are being kicked around right now, but nothing that I know for certain has been filed yet. There's a couple. There were a few grocery store workers, working in the deli at a grocery store, and they passed away. Their employer denied the case under workers' comp. Then you have to deal with all kinds of immunity issues, and in Florida, circuit courts don't like workers' comp cases. They're going to do everything they can to keep you in workers' comp court. So they file their claim. If it gets denied in comp, well, then constitutionally in Florida, there's got to be a remedy. So I think there are going to be some cases filed.
David, what are you hearing in state about the same? About filed?
I'm not aware of any work comp cases being filed related to coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No cases in Alabama getting filed?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not saying they haven't. I just don't know of any yet that have been filed.
I know that it sounds pretty similar to Paolo's experience, that a lot of colleagues are talking about it and trying to figure out the best way to approach this. But probably for both of our situations, both states, you really are going to have some permanency if the client is expecting any type of compensation. Now, medical care is I'm sure going to be their first um, concern. How's my medical care going to be covered if I don't have health insurance? And I think this is work related. Maybe I do need to file a lawsuit, or I don't know how else I'm going to get it paid for. But the other part of the equation that we always talk about is just what you mentioned, Paolo and Dave. What if there's no permanency to this condition and they make a full recovery? What does Alabama say about that?
Well, in Alabama, then you're looking at just payment for medical treatment and possibly a few weeks of temporary total disability benefits, which is 2/3 of the average weekly wage. And that's about all they'd be entitled to if there's no permanent injury.
Right.
Paolo,
We don't even know. We don't even know what the treatment would consist of. I mean, there haven't been any, epidemiological tests. We don't have a vaccine yet. What's the treatment? Go home and chicken soup and Gatorade and, hope you don't end up on a ventilator is the treatment, right? I mean, that. So when you're asked, so I understand that what the insurance companies are saying. How the heck do we treat this? Um,
They don't want to. They don't want to open that can of worms. They don't want to.
They don't.
well, speaking of can of worms, it's going to lead us to our last topic. And we all can agree that we'd love to see college football played starting in late August, September. It's something, at least in the South, that's what we live for. And I know that is being hotly debated, that college campuses, at least from a sports standpoint, are permitted to start having their kids on campus and training and doing things, and slowly rolling this out. University of Texas came out with this monstrous book, 48-page guideline, which I know you both read cover to cover, being such Texas Longhorn fans that you are. But the reality is, when you have 375 employees in your football office at the end of your stadium on campus, you've got to come up with some specific guidelines how this can go forward. While I'm not going to ask you what's on page 19 about hand washing, I do want to talk about how do you guys envision college football? I'm giving you the prognostication tool here. How do you see college football or any college sports unfolding and being able to go forward in the fall?
I'll just start with this. I did read page 1 of the 48-page guide, and interestingly, it starts off with if Colt hadn't gotten hurt, and that's in reference, to the 2010 BCS national championship game that Alabama won, Roll Tide. I think there's some important things here, and I'm just going to mention them real quick. Talks about passing a temperature check to get into their building, wearing face covering at all times, and practicing social distancing, and that being the new normal. And I just think those are some important things that whether we work for the University of Texas Athletic Department or whether we own our own law firms, those are important things right there. Wash your hands, get your temperature checked regularly, practice social distancing, wear face covering. Those are things that we can all do. Paolo, I'll turn it over to you to jump in on that.
Agreed. And as long as Nick Saban says we can play football, I mean, that's fine with me. So that's really all I'm concerned about. If Texas wants to come play us, then let's bring it on.
Yeah, I listened to a couple minutes of Feinbaum this afternoon, and I believe he had Will Muschamp on, his head coach at South Carolina, and he was talking about the things they're going to be doing starting in just a couple of days in June to bring their athletes, their players back onto campus. Some of those things, again, we're checking temperatures, getting them tested, and then using face coverings as well. So I think you're going to see more kids coming back to school in June, more athletes back to school.
In all seriousness, the real question that nobody's asking is, or the real topic that nobody's talking about is the money. Okay. Mm-hmm. The NCAA is going to do whatever they got to do to get football and athletics going back on. After they cut off the basketball tournament in March, they said this really hurts. Could you imagine the revenue loss of no college football in the fall in this country? I mean, short of a zombie apocalypse, there's going to be football. Now they're going to have to implement some of these things, the masks and the social distancing. You know, there are going to be some ticket holders that are upset because they can't go to a live football game. I mean, whether they have to play football with nobody in the stands, you know, there are going to be games on TV come the fall.
Yeah.
That's just, you know, write that down, Bernard.
Well, you know, let's back up even further away from the sports aspect of colleges and universities in the fall. We all heard the head of the University of Alabama system, and I heard the University of Georgia system head announce, they put out press statements, or maybe even it was an interview or a press conference last month, that the schools will open in the fall. Campuses will be open in the fall because those schools, as well endowed as they may have from in their coffers, those schools and the programs would crumble without the kids enrolling in those types of things, tuitions, et cetera, and all of what's built into there, because there's a trickle down from that. My daughter goes to the University of Georgia. Sorry, Paolo, David already knows this. We live here in Alabama, so I'm paying out-of-state tuition. If Georgia says we're strictly going online, why would I want to now, if she's living in my home, why would I want to pay out-of-state tuition prices where if she stayed in state and went online? Now, this is assuming that Georgia, if they did that, didn't modify their tuition policies for out-of-state.
And assuming Alabama would condescend to having her if she picked Georgia anyway, but let's assume that'll happen.
Well, that's true. But the issue then trickles down to smaller, the junior colleges.
Right.
Their enrollments are flying up the charts right now. They're having to put in extra staff, and they're just, and my point here being is one has to precede the other, which has to go forward before anything from a college football or college sports can take place. So those announcements, because I think there's certain timing of events that have to take place during the calendar year, you know, when the kids have to announce or make their decisions by May 1st each year, the seniors, of where they're going to commit to school-wise, not athletes per se, but regular students, all of these things have to take place in a certain timely event, because putting on the college campus school term, putting on the college football season, so much has to take place way in advance, like now. So here's where I'm going with my question to you guys. Do you see a college football game, a stadium, full, half full, just students, just in the boxes up, you know, the fancy boxes? What kind of stadium atmosphere do you see? Right now, the Korean Baseball League is the only professional league, or it was the first one, excuse me, that started, and they have no fans in the stands, but they have all these cardboard cutouts. It looks really weird. And you may not know this, but they have yell leaders on each side of the field for the respective teams, that during the regular, when the stadium's full, these leaders actually, it's like cheerleaders, they lead, and they're in this, it's so bizarre. They're screaming for cardboard cutouts. But when you watch it on TV, you hear every bit of this coming through the commentating. So what do you see from a college football campus game day wise? You're not going to see 150,000 people on an SEC game day in Tuscaloosa anymore.
Well, if they let people go to the stadiums, they'll be full. But I could see games on TV with no fans, like the European soccer leagues are back up right now. They're playing games, they're putting them on TV and the stands are empty. I can see, SEC football going with empty stands. I could see football games on if campuses are even closed. I mean, I don't see any possibility that there's no football, but it's going to be definitely different. Maybe they try it for a little while and then they let 25%, but then you got to pick who's going to get the tickets and who's not. So I think either they're going to let people go or they're not going to let people go. But I could envision a season this year where we're watching games and they've got piped in music and cheering and bands and stuff.
Well, I know you're a big, go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to read one sentence from the article about the University of Texas. I think this is important in talking about whether we're going to put 80,000 or let 100,000 people go sit in a football stadium in August or September in the South. Remember, there is the possibility that you have already contracted COVID-19 and are an asymptomatic carrier who is capable of spreading the virus despite not showing symptoms. Mm-hmm. You should always conduct yourself as if you have it. Mm-hmm. You know, you put 80,000 people in the stands, people have it, they don't know it, they're spreading it, and that's the problem.
19-year-old athletes are, you know, no one can defeat them in their mindset. I don't care if I get it or not, I'm going to be fine. Well, what about the 70-year-old you come in contact with, or the person with the heart condition? Paolo, I know you're a big supporter of the Orlando pro soccer team. Have there been any announcements from their management or ownership about how their season may be played out?
Well, so the MLS hasn't, they're going to start training. So my kids play on the, you know, the junior development team, and, you know, they're going back to training next week. The kids are. So the professional athletes in the MLS are going to start, and they're probably going to finish the season later. The MLS season, you know, just started. So they're not missing, you know, they're missing about the first quarter of the season. They can make up those games. The MLS season doesn't end until October. So they're going to make up those seasons. But yeah, I'm a season ticket holder, and I got to go to one game, the first game, and then everything got shut down. So I'm definitely hoping to get back to a game, but you know what? I think I'll be fine this year, watching them on TV. And as long as I can watch them on TV, and, you know, the teams here are adding on, you know, they'll give us our tickets for next year. You know, everybody's been really good. Disney and Universal and everything here in town, whatever days the parks are closed, are adding on those days at the end of your annual passes, which is nice. So I don't have any doubt that our professional soccer team will do the same thing, but they're all planning to get started again. And I think the pros are going to start training again next week, and they're going to start looking to play in July and get the season back going.
Just some sense of some normalcy back into what normal life used to be, and what we're used to is what we're all looking for. Paolo, thank you for spending some time with us today, bud. It's always good to chat with you and see you, and hopefully we get to break bread with you sometime in the future.
I'm looking forward to it. Always good to see you guys. Whatever I can do for the Nomberg boys, just pick up the phone.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Paolo.
As we do each month, the fourth Thursday, we try to come to you, usually on YouTube. It was not acting right today, so we're on Facebook for today. But Alabama Work Comp Today, we try to bring to you national headlines. We bring on a colleague, a friend of ours from different parts of the country who does similar work that we do. And Paolo and his awesome law firm certainly do that. They're some of the very best in the state of Florida. And we try to talk about national headlines, things of importance. Hopefully, the pandemic and these issues are not going to always monopolize our time like they have the last two sessions, but it's very important that we talk about these things, because it's what everybody's talking about. We don't have all the answers, but by talking about them, we push through them, and we try to come up with some sense of normalcy, whatever that new sense is. But we're going to come to you again next month. It'll be June 25th. We've got our buddy Tom Murphy out of Montana. Tom is such a great lawyer, and y'all are going to really, really enjoy hearing from him and his take on life in Montana. So
I'm going to watch that episode too, because Tom's a good guy.
Well, he certainly is. Dave, I'm going to let you have the last word before we get out of here for this episode. So I want to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I just realized that we're almost done, and we haven't said the word Amazon, Uber, gig economy. So I don't think the show is complete until those words have been said. So now we've said them. Paolo, those are just obviously topics, employers that have dominated our work comp and employment landscape since we started this show back in September. And I think every show we've talked about them. So
Oops, not having to
talk. Oh, there I am.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I just got, before we started the show, I got a notice on my phone from Uber saying that they're back up and running. So I guess they need to take a ride.
Okay. So the show is now complete. We mentioned Uber, Amazon, Gig, and Lyft.
Well, guys, just continue to be patient, be smart about your daily activities. We're gonna get through this at some point into the hopefully immediate future. I know that every state's societies are slowly rolling back out, but as always, you can reach us in Birmingham, Paolo's office, and I'm going to put all the contact information for his firm in the show notes. But thank you guys for spending some time. Paolo, as always, thank you, bud. Y'all have a good rest of your week.
Be safe.
Good to see you.